Number 406, more about Jesus.
More about Jesus would I know, more of his grace to others show, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me, more about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. More about Jesus, let me learn, more of his holy will discern, Spirit of God my teacher be, showing the things of Christ to me. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. More about Jesus on his throne, riches and glory all his own, more of his kingdom sure increase, more of his coming Prince of Peace. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. Now be dismissed to class.
Good morning. So you should have the material we'll be covering today, which is about the Nazarites in number 6. If you were here last week, you definitely should have it. If you don't, we can get some material to you. Do you need one, Mary? Okay. Dusty, could you grab? And they're right there. Back there. He's going to get you one. Anybody else need one or lost it or? Okay. If you don't want to admit it, you can get one after class. They're back there. We've covered some of that material. You'll notice it's called the adultery test, and of course we very memorably have covered that. But we're now going to talk about the Nazarites, which is interesting, I think, in Numbers chapter 6. So, I don't know that we can be super precise. Let's talk about a few things regarding the Nazarite vow, and we're going to talk about how it fits into Numbers, because some people, as they're reading through Numbers sometimes, and we saw where with the issue of adultery, how that connected in to the idea of the holiness of God and the holiness of his people. And so it's not that it was disconnected from some of the things. It's a shift from some of the things we've looked at, because we've looked at the organization, the census, how the tabernacle would be moved, how God's people would move, preparing them to go to the promised land. But we saw also that when you look at the idea of marital fidelity and faithfulness, how many times God uses that as a figure of Israel's unfaithfulness to him and how important it is. And if they weren't being faithful in their marriages, then they weren't being faithful to God. And therefore, those were very interwoven. So that does, in the theme of Numbers, that makes sense. And in really the theme of the entire Bible. So then we hit the Nazarite vow, and you go, okay, is this just kind of something we need to know? No, it's tied into the holiness of God as well in some pretty interesting ways. So let's just talk about a few people, and usually the people we think of were lifetime Nazarites. Which one of the interesting things about that was that the normal course to be a lifetime Nazarite? Even those who took the Nazarite vow. No, and what we're going to find here in this chapter is most often he even gives instructions about what to do when you shift from what they often called this sense of holiness to purity when they came out of that Nazirite vow, what to do. And we'll talk about that. That's kind of interesting because the ones we think of tend to be pretty much lifers, we might say. So let's think about that. Who are some of the people that maybe come to mind that you think of that most probably were Nazirites? Who? Samson. Man, Samson. Yeah, for sure. Who else? Samuel. Who else? Is that it? Either way. Yeah. There's some question, but that's about Acts 21. There were a number of men who they speak of there regarding their vow, and they're following the instructions of this. So, yeah, okay. So I had a big discussion with an Old Testament professor one time about John the Baptist. It's not completely explicit, but it just seems to me if you look at John, he most probably had taken that Nazirite vow. That's my opinion, but I think he was probably a Nazirite, which makes a lot of sense if you look at his background. So there are some unique people that were Nazirites, and sometimes you wonder, okay, what's all that about? And so we're going to study more about that. Often they were more temporary. Now, there's something interesting. Were there any limitations among God's people on who could take the Nazirite vow? Could only men take the Nazirite vow? No, men and women. Men and women. What were you going to say? Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. Yeah, that was one that when I was doing a little bit of research, we don't normally think of, but that's true. I think so. So we have a number of people that this is mentioned or at least alluded to or referenced in some way or implied. But this was a vow men and women could take, and we learned that from Numbers 6. So let's look at Numbers, the 6th chapter. And I know we read this last week, but let's try to get it in our mind again. In verse 1, again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man or woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to dedicate himself to the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink, nor shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat flesh or dried grapes. All the days of his separation he shall not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, from the seeds even to the skin. All the days of his vow of separation no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall let the locks of hair on his head grow long. All the days of his separation to the Lord he shall not go near to a dead person. He shall not make himself unclean for his father or for his mother, for his brother or for his sister when they die, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. But if a man dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his dedicated head of hair, then he shall shave his head on the day when he becomes clean, and he shall shave it on the 7th day. Then on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest, to the doorway of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him concerning his sin because of the dead person. And that day he shall consecrate his head, and shall dedicate to the Lord his days as a Nazirite, and shall bring a male lamb a year old for a guilt offering. But the former days will be void, because his separation was defiled. Now this is the law of the Nazirite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall bring the offering to the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall present his offering to the Lord, 1 male lamb a year old without defect for a burnt offering, and 1 ewe lamb a year old without defect for a sin offering, and 1 ram without defect for a peace offering. and a basket of unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil and unleavened wafers spread with oil, along with their grain offering and their drink offering. Then the priest shall present them before the Lord and shall offer his sin offering and his burnt offering. He shall also offer the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, together with a basket of unleavened cakes. The priest shall likewise offer its grain offering and its drink offering. And the Nazirite shall then shave his dedicated head of hair at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and take the dedicated hair of his head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of peace offerings. The priest shall take the ram's shoulder when it has been boiled, and notice this, and one unleavened cake out of the basket and one unleavened wafer, and he shall put them on the hands of the Nazirite after he has shaved his dedicated hair. Then the priest, now a lot of this you're wondering, okay, why are they doing all this? But look at verse 20. Then the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. It is holy for the priest, together with the breast offered by waving and the thigh offered by lifting up, and afterward the Nazirite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazirite who vows his offering to the Lord according to his separation, in addition to what else he can afford, according to his vow which he takes. So he shall do according to the law of his separation. So let's talk about the Nazirites, and there's going to be a priestly blessing which might actually surprise you a little bit. But again, and this goes back to what we were talking about, the nation early on in Numbers has been organized and is being organized as the holy people of God. You remember we began in Exodus 19 when they're called to be God's people. So the idea of holiness and the idea of God's mission and God's purpose for them, that's all together. So the Nazirites are interesting because the Nazirites demonstrated the truth that the priests were not the only ones called to holiness. Now let's talk about the idea of holiness. So there's a general sense in which we think of holiness. There's a more generic sense in which every child of God within Israel was to be striving to be holy. But from a ritual sense, there was a sense in which everybody was to be pure, but there's a kind of holiness that seems even distinct from that. So we've talked about the priest and we talked about the tabernacle. Could people just kind of walk in to the tabernacle? No. So when we talk about holiness in that sense, we've talked about even the furnishings within the tabernacle, all of that being holy, it's sacred. Not just from an ethical or moral standpoint, but when you talk about the furnishings of the tabernacle from a ritual standpoint, everything has to be holy. So it can't be defiled. So we're talking about holiness with the Nazirites almost in the same kind of sense, not necessarily regarding the tabernacle, but just generally. The same kind of sense in which there was a special holiness of the priesthood. But these people aren't part of the priesthood, but they are taking a very serious vow of holiness before God. And we'll talk more about that. So purity, again, is the emphasis of number 6 as it was in chapter 5. So none of this has really changed. The idea of sanctification before God. Now this is a special vow just like the priesthood was special. So stay in there with me. So God gave these regulations. So there had to be some purpose of this for Israel as a whole to learn something or to be aware of something. And I think what they needed to be aware of was vows and promises and faithfulness and holiness. Okay, so when you read through Numbers, don't look at it like, well, chapter 1 and 2 is over here and chapters 5 and 6 are over here. See it more like a story, okay? And all of these things are important components for them to go to the promised land. So something else that's interesting, and let's go ahead and look at this, chapter 6, and you may say, okay, I knew that was in Numbers, but a lot of people say, oh, no, I thought that was in Psalms or something like that. No, this is in Numbers, this priestly blessing. So coming out of this vow of holiness, we have what's called this priestly blessing that's pronounced. Look at it. It should be familiar to you. Let's read verses 22 through 27. Verses 22 through verse 27. Dusty, can you read that? for us? Yeah, Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 27. Does that sound familiar to you? That's where that hymn. Yeah. Yeah, the Lord bless you and keep you. Not an easy one to sing, but it's a beautiful hymn. That comes from the book of Numbers. So, do we read a lot about the wrath of God and the judgment of God and all of that in Numbers? Yes, we do. But there will be sections like this where you still read about God's grace toward his people. So, there are those who try to argue, the God of the Old Testament, it's almost as if the God of the Old Testament is all wrath and the God of the New Testament's all love in their definition of love. And of course we know that's not the case. The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. Now, are there predominant themes that get emphasized through Jesus Christ and through the gospel of God's grace and mercy and everything coming to fruition for us? Well, certainly. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on that. But we can go to passages in the New Testament that speak of the severity of God's judgment as well as the mercy of God, for instance, in Romans 11:22. And we can go to, there's a number of passages in the New Testament that speak to that. And while certainly this sense of God's holiness for good reason is emphasized, and God is king and sovereign and judge because he's over Israel in a very particular way, is that emphasized? Yes, but so is his mercy. So is his graciousness and his faithfulness and his kindness. And he wants that reflected in Israel. So I wanted to go ahead and get that out there in front of us. This priestly blessing, Aaron's benediction, some call it, comes out of an emphasis on God's holiness, which is interesting because I do think some have the notion that holiness and grace are just, and God's love are almost these separate entities and the two shall never meet. That's not what we read in the Bible. And so even in this context, we've had 2 chapters that have emphasized Israel's holiness and the importance of faithfulness to God. But those same sections emphasize how God's mercy comes from that. So that's important for us to see in the covenant relationship. Darryl, go ahead. I think so. Yeah, because it's more likely he's given regulations of something that they had some knowledge of. Right? What are your thoughts about it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It does make you wonder. I read some thoughts about that from several commentaries that mention the very thing you said. It's hard to find any source of that, but it is implied they had some knowledge of it because he's given regulations about a thing. He doesn't really say, hey, I want you to start doing this. So that very well may be the possibility. And maybe it was just something that they understood that they had been doing but just hadn't been mentioned to us. So it is now, though, so we get some great insights, but I think that's an interesting point. Okay, so let's talk about it. So the word Nazarite, Nazir, you see this in chapter 6 in verse 2, in verse 19, verse 21, as you might imagine, actually means one separated. Now that's kind of interesting. The Pharisees were the separate ones later on when they came to be in the New Testament times. But the idea here is to be separated, comes from the Hebrew word nazar, which indicates a decision to dedicate. So it's voluntary. I mean, you're taking the vow, but you're promising to dedicate or devote yourself wholly and entirely to God. And and often this is the case when you think of consecration or you think of of sanctification. There are times that's talking about salvation, but there's times where that's not the primary point. It's separated for a purpose. And so that's important to keep in mind. It is interesting in chapter 6 and verse 2, this is one case where either men or women could take this particular vow. And it's going to teach a lesson to the people as a whole. Interestingly, some of the rules for the Nazarites, and this is worth noting, some of the rules for the Nazarites are very similar to the same regulations for the priest. But in some ways, some of these regulations for the Nazarites were even more strict than what the priest had. Can you think of an example from our reading? Okay, yeah, that was one of them. Right. So like for the priest, and Alan's right, so for the priest, because dead bodies were seen as being unclean, but priests it's basically an exception clause if somebody really close to you dies. So they were able to grieve in that way. In this case, he says, even if a brother or sister, even if one of your parents, that's part of this Nazarite vow. So, lesson here, there are times when these kinds of promises or vows that one gave required great sacrifice. There is a sense in which, while that's not the case, not a ritual uncleanness from certainly grieving over a loved one that has died, but Jesus does emphasize in discipleship that we're not to put our loved ones before the Lord himself. We see that even in a very physical sense for the Nazarites, but certainly in a spiritual sense for all of God's people. So that is interesting, but there's some things that are going to be similar to the regulations of the high priest here. So as Roger mentioned, the priests were not permitted to drink wine while participating in tabernacle service, but as we've already read, the Nazarites weren't allowed to even get close to it. I mean, they were not to be doing this in any sense. They weren't permitted to drink wine or anything associated with it. That's there in chapter 6 and verses 3 and 4. And Ashley, who just writes a very good commentary on Numbers, he says, one can easily see it as God's, and this is important because I want us to keep seeing the story and the narrative of this so we don't get lost. He says one can easily see it as God's preparation of these people to live in a Canaanite culture as a different or a holy people. I mean, they're going to be going, and we know this, they're going to Canaan. So he's preparing them for this. So it's not just, yes, there's the Nazarites and the vow they take, but all of God's, there's a sense in which their vow is sending a message to all of the Canaan, or to all of Israel about where they're going and being devoted to the Lord. And while not every Israelite has all of those regulations upon them, this is sending a message of commitment and holiness and devotion to God that they should come to appreciate. And I think that's a purpose that it carries out. And any of those vows in the Old Testament would probably fall into that category. Roger. Mm-hmm. I'm not for sure. Of course, we often get in discussions about wine, but this even includes grapes and the skin and raisins. Yeah. So I'll go look at that, but I will. Even though not all of that would intoxicate it, it's almost as if you're getting as far away from anything like that could come even close to that. I'll look at that, but I did notice that when I was reading through. But again, this isn't every Israelite. It's not even all the priests. So there's something about self-denial that Nazirite vow is involving compared to what others are participating in. So that's all I got on that. I'll look at it though. That's a good question. Anybody have thoughts? Go ahead, Kimberly. Mm-hmm. Close to it. Yeah, I think that's probably right. It does seem like he's just really separating them out from anything that comes close to that idea. And that would make sense, kind of, like we know the potential of that, but he's saying don't eat the grape, don't even get the skin, don't do any of that. It may just be, what'd you say? Yeah, well, there is that passage too. But anyway, that's the best I have right now. I think so. Rachel? So it's anything from a vine. That's right. Okay. So there's something about ritual purity on some level about grapes and wine and anything associated with that, which kind of comes back to what we're talking about, I think. So that's a good point. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was going to mention, and that's a good point, Conley. So fermentation is seen as defilement in some context on some level. And it does seem like they're staying away. And that fits with Samson's mother and just the Nazirite vow in general. Because this isn't the only area we're going to see where they're just staying as far away from that as possible. Daryl, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Did y'all hear what Daryl said? He said fermentation is, what'd you say, close cousin? It's a first cousin to leavened bread. So in the Old Testament, fermentation. So we all know the indication of a leavening process and how unleavened bread is seen versus leaven. Leaven is seen as something that is a contaminant on some level, and therefore it's used to refer in the New Testament often, not always. Sometimes the kingdom's called leaven, but mainly it refers to something that defiles and would lead to sin, or describes as sin, something that's impure. So that would make sense. The whole idea of fermentation and maybe connecting that to leaven, that makes sense to me. Okay? Anybody? All right, and the big picture. So the big picture is, and all that fits into what we're talking about now, Nazirites could not shave the hair of their head. If you look at Numbers chapter 6 and verse 5, and that was seen as a sign of devotion to God. Let's look at it again. Chapter 6 and verse 5, all the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled. So this is what I was trying to say. So holiness in a general sense, as we might think of it, and sometimes it's used in the Old Testament this way, and even in Numbers this way, to just speak of being in right relationship with God and being pure before God. He's using holy in a distinctive way here. So it's almost as if everybody should be pure before God, and if you're impure, there's a process that you follow to be right with God and to take care of that. But holiness here is used in a special way because of this vow. So you're being true to your vow. So if you notice there in verse 5, he shall be holy until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. For the vow, okay. So I think that's talking about ritual holiness before God because of the vow. He shall let the locks of hair on his head grow long. And then he says in verse 7, he shall not make himself unclean for his father or for his mother, for his brother or for his sister when they die, because of his separation to God is on his head. Let's talk a little bit about that. So what's he talking about when he says this sign of separation to God is on his head? Obviously. Hair. Hair there, for him or her, is a symbol. It's part of the vow. It's not inherently about having hair on your head. I hope not. But it is certainly in this vow, it's a representation of that commitment. So there are kind of these markers to show this separation. Israel needs to learn the lesson. There needs to be a separation between them and these other nations that aren't serving God. So if you look at verse 8 again, he comes back, all the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. So again, you see that emphasis of this holiness to the Lord. So they weren't to shave their head. That's a sign of devotion to God. They weren't to be near a dead body, even during family mourning. You think about the sacrifice of that. I mean, you know going in, when you make this vow, if my parents pass, or my brother or sister passes, that's part of the vow. That's part of the commitment. And so it distinguishes them in that way. And they're having to make a sacrifice to do this. Go ahead. Ooh, that's good. Yeah. So that principle, though, that this service to God requires sacrifice, and sacrifices that often are difficult, is something worthy of us thinking about. Betsy? Oh, yeah, that's right. That is a good point. You guys remember, I don't know if you heard what Betsy said, but one of the excuses is, let me go. Wouldn't it bury my father? And Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead. That's not a completely unprecedented call when you think about this, except it's for all of us as disciples. Very good. So, all right. So to dedicate one's hair was not a uniquely Israelite practice, by the way. It was practiced in some other areas in the Near East. This is interesting to me. Look at this with me. So the same root, Nezer translated separation there in chapter 6 and verse 7, or dedicated head of hair in chapter 6 and verse 9, referring to the Nazirite not cutting his hair. That particular term is used of the high priest, diadem, anointing oil, and royal crowns. So they had a particular crown that they wore. That same, so the description of the Nazirite's hair is, I just thought that was interesting, is very much connected to the recognition of the high priest. It's not saying he's the high priest, but it is saying, at least among God's people, this idea of this particular vow and commitment and devotion was to be respected. Just as you would respect the high priest for his service, they needed to see the Nazirite vow as not something that's trivial, but something they appreciated in others because they recognized the sacrifices that were involved. And you can see that. It's in your notes, Leviticus 8:9 and 2 Kings 11:12. So the Nazirite vows often were for temporary periods of time. We've talked about Samson, probably Samuel, were dedicated by their parents according to the will of God to be lifelong Nazirites even before they were born. You can read about that in Judges 13:4 and 5, and obviously it was the purpose of God for Samson, and Samson's mother took that into consideration when you think about that vow in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11. So they were to be highly respected. We should appreciate a sense of commitment and devotion and holiness to God. Let's turn to Amos 2:11 through 14. I want you to notice this with me. Amos, the 2nd chapter, let's read verses 11 through 14. Amos chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Alan, can you get that, please? This passage struck me because he's recognizing their unfaithfulness. And when he's recognizing their unfaithfulness, he's saying, you haven't appreciated the revelation of my will. You haven't appreciated my holiness. You haven't appreciated what I've done to try to drive those ideas home. And it's because of your own unfaithfulness that you don't appreciate what I provided among my people to you. Okay. What are the two people he mentions here? Prophets and Nazarite. You know, you might be expecting him to, which there was a corruption of the priesthood and all that, but you might be thinking he would say prophets and priests, and he could have, but he doesn't. He says prophets and Nazarites. When you think about a prophet, what's a prophet's mission? Yeah, to reveal the will of God. He's a teacher. God's message is coming through him. Often the Old Testament will talk about the burden of God or the oracle of God being put to him. So he is a messenger proclaiming God's truth. Often it had to do with God's warnings, God's judgment, all of that. It's interesting that in that context, he talks about Nazarites. And I think probably the reason he does is not necessarily because they are orally, proclaiming God's will, but by their commitment, by their vow, they are declaring God's holiness. And that should have been something appreciated and respected, not just because of them, but because of what that said about God. And it should have been, even if you don't take the Nazarite vow, and many didn't, you would think that would have encouraged them in their own life. Let me give you an example. So let's say there's somebody that we know, and maybe they are called on to be a disciple of the Lord. They have to make unusually extraordinary sacrifices in comparison to what others might make. And as a faithful Christian, even if I never have to make that type of sacrifice, if I am indifferent about that, if it doesn't even register with me, that says something about me. Whereas if I take notice of that and I appreciate that, and we've had a lot of people, and sometimes they feel very tragic, loved ones. Maybe somebody at a very young age has a terminal illness. And the way they handle that, the things they say, and then that causes us to introspectively say, if I was dealing with that, would I deal with it that way? Would I be that devoted as I should to the Lord? That's my point, that I think the Nazarites were sending a message, and Amos is saying, you hadn't gotten the message. You're not getting it from the prophets who are preaching it. You're not even getting it from young men who have taken this Nazarite vow. You don't seem to appreciate that, and that's reflective of your own unfaithfulness to God. So I think there is an important point there that we can all take with us. So Wenham, commentator, argues that the vows mentioned, there you go, Alan, Acts 18 and 21, may have been Nazarite vows, probably were. John the Baptist may also have been a Nazarite. that just, to me, that fits with the context of Scripture. So, what happens if you're a Nazirite, though? And you've taken this vow, you're trying to do everything, and Uncle Joe is beside you, and he dies. I mean, you didn't know he was going to die. It's not like you were jeopardizing yourself and didn't care about your vow, but here somebody is, and they're right beside you, and they die. I mean, it could happen. And so you're in proximity to a dead body, and you're a Nazirite who's vowed that you're not going to do that if you can keep from it. So does God say, okay, we'll just pass over that, no issue? This is another lesson here. Okay, now, yeah, it does. It does, Roger. So there's some discussion about this. Sometimes sin is used to talk about, and this is usually the way we think of it, and often, frequently, this is what is being talked about in the Bible. Sin, most often, is dealing with moral, ethical, what we think of as sinning against God. Sometimes it's used not necessarily because there's some moral deficiency in somebody or that they are rebelling against God, but it has to do with a vow or ritual teaching that God has given about being holy and clean. And so when you look at what's happening here, to the point, God still takes it seriously. God takes all defilement and contamination seriously. But he gives a way for this to be dealt with. So it's not that there's not a way, and there is an underlying message here, I think. So there are these conditions. Now, could the person make themselves right without God's mercy? This is actually a case of God's mercy. So again, yes, God's mercy is in the book of Numbers. However, God giving mercy in this way also involved them doing what God said, making the proper sacrifices and meeting the conditions. Now then, our situation today is similar in a way. If it wasn't for Jesus and his atonement and his sacrifice, we would have no hope. However, that doesn't mean God has not offered any conditions for us to meet, and that's not earning or meriting anything. Did they really deserve? No, not really. None of us deserve anything from God, but I just want you to see there is some kind of underlying, shadowing, pointing toward the idea of sacrifice and conditions and faith and God's mercy. So let's notice, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so we can get through this. So here we have an accidental thing. So if someone died suddenly beside him, he was rendered unclean and remained unclean for 7 days, which is interesting length of time there. On the seventh day, he became clean. And it was on that day that he was to now shave his head. Okay, so he has to shave his head. Leviticus 5:14 through 16, we're not going to read it, but it talks about these kinds of situations and addresses sacrifices for unintentional sins. I will tell you, while unintentional sins are still an issue, God does see a difference. It doesn't mean that one couldn't unintentionally sin and then once he realizes it, have a bad attitude about it. But the point is, here somebody is that's trying, and here somebody is that's just in full rebellion to God, which is often called self-willed or presumptuous sins. You even read about that in the Old Testament. So, we have these sacrifices. So on the seventh day, he's technically considered clean. On the eighth day, he was to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the tabernacle to atone for his defilement. So God took it very seriously. You can read about that in Leviticus and those verses I gave you. So where does he go? I know it's on the board, but where does he go at this point? Which fits with our understanding of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting and God's presence. Where does he go? He goes to the door of the tent of meeting, or the entryway. One of these birds was to be offered as a sin offering, as was mentioned. Sometimes they were for ritual purification. The whole burnt offering, this is interesting, so stay with me. The whole burnt offering indicates a desire for the presence of God. So it invokes the presence of God. Only after the purification could a vow be taken again. Now here's what happens. So if this were to occur, and this happens, and you do all these things you're supposed to do, so what about the timing? Let's say you had been keeping the vow for a while. What happens on the timing? Yeah, well, you go back to the beginning. So it's not like he says, well, you get half time, I'll give you, you start the vow over, basically, whatever your vow is. Again, noticing how important holiness is. So the Nazirite offers a male lamb a year old as he rededicates himself for the time period he had originally intended to be consecrated. So originally, you know how long, and so you go back to the beginning. So the items for the sin offering and the burnt offering would be given to the priest. He would present them before the Lord. The Nazirite would shave his head of hair at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and that would be dedicated as a sacrifice of peace offerings. And the peace offering was the only animal sacrifice in which the worshiper actually enjoyed a portion of the meat. And that was really fun. We'll stop right there. Read the end of Leviticus. I want us to talk about that priestly blessing next week. We'll finish this up.